Hello and good evening. I'm live all the way from Paris. I'm Hugo Kruger, and I'm speaking today to a Professor Emeritus in nuclear physics, Professor Wade Allison. Is Professor the right title for Professor Emeritus?
Yes. I mean, it just means I was professor and I'm retired.
Okay, so you still have the knowledge. You don't lose the knowledge.
Yes, and I still have the connections, but not the duties. I don't have to look after students or sit on committees.
Oh, that's great. So, if you mind, give us an introduction about your background and how it relates to nuclear science.
Well, when I was a 13-year-old boy, I happened to be in France with my parents, and they took us as children to Geneva, and there was a big exhibition on in the Palais des Nations on nuclear science and what it could do, what nuclear energy could do for everybody. And in fact, this was a long time ago. It was 1954, and I went home and I said, I think I'm going to study science. And outreach happens sometimes over very long periods, but here I am now, and I'm pursuing and trying to explain to people why nuclear energy is a good thing.
Okay, so 1945, that is when the war ended. So I knew
No, 1954.
1954. Okay, yeah. So let's take it after. And
I should say I then spent my career doing physics at CERN and in the United States and places, and teaching most of science at Oxford. And I started a course on medical physics, which is a fascinating subject because of all the imaging techniques and radiotherapy and so on. And it's very good for physics students, because particularly getting girls into science, they can see that the mathematics that they use can be used for helping people in bedroom slippers and doing projects in the hospitals and so on. And this was a big success. And when I finished that, I wrote a textbook, and quite an advanced mathematical textbook on medical physics. And then I gave a popular talk in my college to old members of the college. And I was amazed to find they didn't know anything about nuclear. And it was quite easy to explain to them. So I have spent the last 20 years working on this, and I've written 2 books, Radiation and Reason, Nuclear is for Life. They're not high-tech books. It's about reassuring people and explaining to them what nuclear is all about. One of the books was written before Fukushima, and the other was afterwards. It didn't make any difference because we didn't learn anything at Fukushima.
We learned the wrong things. Yeah.
Well, I went there and it was all exactly as I was expecting. People were frightened. The main effect of Fukushima was people lost trust. They lost trust in one another. They lost trust in authority. They lost trust in science. And that was very sad. But in fact, nobody was affected by the radiation at all. None at all.
We will get into the radiation topic a little bit later.
Indeed.
I want to backtrack to nuclear energy. When it comes to nuclear energy, the topic that always comes up is energy density. And nuclear energy is far more dense than any other fields. Can you just give us an idea, why is that so important to understand? And why do we misunderstand it?
Well, you don't have to understand much science to get the message about nuclear. But there are 2 things about energy. One is it's conserved. So it's got to come from somewhere. You can't make it. You can change it from one place to one thing, one form to another, but it's got to come from somewhere. So when you're looking about energy, you've got to go and find it, because you can't make it. I mean, they tried in the 18th century building perpetual motion machines to see whether you could get energy without having to provide it from somewhere, and it didn't work. So, and the next thing is that energy always goes downhill. If you have a boulder at the top of a hill, it can't roll uphill. Similarly, if you have a hot cup of coffee, it can only get colder. And if you have two half cold, slightly warm cups of coffee, you can't make one hot cup of coffee out of them. So it matters whether the energy is concentrated. And you can't concentrate it without doing a lot of work, which is a form of energy, of course. And this is, on the back of a postage stamp, the story of thermodynamics. And those are the two things you need to know. It's got to come from somewhere, it's got to go somewhere, and it always goes downhill. So we need to find energy which is uphill. We need to find the hottest cup of coffee. We can always cool it down. We can always divide it and make it cooler, but we can't make it hotter. So the race is on to find the most concentrated energy. And renewables are pathetically unconcentrated. And that is why the plants, the windmills, are so huge, why the reservoirs behind hydroelectric dams are vast and do immense damage to nature. It's rather strange that people should see renewables as positive for the environment. They're extremely negative for the environment. But fossil fuels are much better because it's much more concentrated, about 10,000 times the energy concentration. But let's worry too much about the numbers. And then nuclear is 1,000,000 times more concentrated again. Why this is so and how it was discovered and so on, of course, is a fascinating story. But I copied the other day what Winston Churchill wrote in 1931. I don't know who taught him, but he got exactly the right idea. Well, he said that you get 1,000,000 times the energy concentration from nuclear as you do from chemistry and from fossil fuels. And this is
Winston
actually
Churchill knew about nuclear. Oh yeah,
sorry. It actually comes from the fact that the nucleus is 100,000 times smaller than the atom, and so the protons and neutrons inside the nucleus are confined to 100,000 times smaller distance. And we could get on discuss why this is so, but you don't need to understand why it's so. To drive a car, to decide that you want a car, to light a fire, you don't need to know all the chemistry and so on.
You don't need
to know it's a good thing. But in my books, I have written in simple ways why the energy of nuclear is 1,000,000 times. It's not a coincidence. It's not made up. It's not 100,000 times or 10 million times. It's 1,000,000 times. Pretty much exactly that.
And in the article,
that's really exciting. It's a wonderful, wonderful gift. And people talk about Mother Nature, meaning renewables. Well, it's all Mother Nature. We didn't make anything. We, the universe we live in is Mother Nature, and that includes nuclear and renewables and fossil fuels.
And are renewables renewable in the vernacular sense?
Well, they get it's a question of where the energy comes from, and it's supplied by the sun, creating clouds and wind and rain and so on. Sometimes, and sometimes it isn't. And so the real problem with renewables is not only that their energy density is so low, but sometimes they're not even there. And then you can't pay for something that isn't there. Money cuts no ice at all when there's nothing to buy. We see it now with gas. If there isn't any gas, what is the price? Well, the price goes up and up and up until somebody says they don't want it. So money is completely useless as a way of arguing. It just causes trouble.
With the wind energy, this is the last question on wind, there's a famous equation which is energy is the it's a function of the cubic airspeed, density of air times the cubic speed. Why is that cubic equation so important?
Oh, this is the maximum energy that you can get from a wind farm. Now, you can make a bigger wind farm, but per square meter of wind turbine, what is the maximum energy you can get? And the energy of anything moving is a half mv squared, half the mass times the square of the speed of what it is that's moving, whatever it is. And that's schoolboy or early undergraduate.
Kinetic energy equals mv squared. Yeah?
Yes, that's right. Now, the amount of wind that hits a square meter of the wind turbine per second is that, in fact, the M is the density times the volume of air. And the volume of air is the area times V. So the mass per second is V times the per square meter is V times the density. And this makes, you've got 2 powers of V from mv squared and another one from the amount of air so that gives you a half rho V cubed per square meter. Now, the wind goes up and down in speed. If the wind halves, which is often, it may both strongly or not so strongly, but if the wind halves, that means the energy goes down by a factor of 8.
Yes.
And at the end of March, for instance, in the UK, the offshore wind, not onshore wind is is not so good, but the offshore wind is what people get excited about. The offshore wind went down by a factor of 8 for a whole week. At 10 gigawatts, the amount of energy that you can't have because it isn't there was that number of 1,760 gigawatt hours of energy. No, times 8.5 rather than 10. Actually is equivalent amount of energy to 2,000 bombs the size of what went off in Beirut in August 2020. People don't realize the amount of energy we're talking about if you're going to supply electricity for a nation. It's a huge amount of energy. And you just can't get it from saying, oh, isn't it nice? I can see the tide is flowing, or the wind is blowing, or the sun is shining. It's just not enough energy that we need. And I don't think we should be spoiling nature, covering it with huge solar panels, which don't last for very long anyway, whereas nuclear stations can be and should last, if they're properly designed, for 60, 80 years. So
that equation, to understand it, puts a physical restraint on the capabilities of wind, and the advocates.
I mean, you can then have an efficient which gets all of that power, or you can have an inefficient one which doesn't do so well, but it can't do better than get all of the energy. That is.
But the advocates would say that you can store it in a battery, for example, or you can compensate it with natural gas.
Then look at the battery that you've got to build. And that battery has got to store in essentially chemical form, because Mr. Faraday was the first to tell us that, in fact, electrical energy and chemical energy are the same thing. So you've got to build a battery which is storing as much energy as 2,000 bombs like went off in Beirut. And that you may be able to do it, but it's a big safety problem. And there are and have been recently, with current technology, a number of serious accidents where batteries have burnt or exploded. They have an internal short, because rather like an explosive, which doesn't need air to burn, it's got its own oxidation source inside it. Similarly, a battery has only got to have an internal short, and it can produce a fire without air.
And when it starts burning, it's very difficult to stop it.
There is water. You may be able to cool it a bit, but you don't put it out with water. And the biggest battery in Australia, for instance, this is less than last summer, the biggest battery in Australia and Victoria, while they were installing it, two of the units, because it spreads, because fires do spread, started to burn, and it took them 4 days to put it out. These things happen. For instance, the two biggest batteries in California at a place called Moss Landings, they both have had to go off the air because of internal shorts and in the last year. So
and here in France, they've retired a few buses as well.
Yes, there have been buses and cars, and the more miles, kilometers you expect to get from your car, more energy you expect, the more dangerous it is, and that there have been problems with Tesla cars and so on. It's not a problem with a mobile phone or a laptop, but as the amount of energy you store goes up, the danger gets much, much, much bigger. Right. And it'll get better. I'm sure we'll learn to do it a bit better. It's better to have what they call flow batteries, where the reagents are removed from one another, and it is more like a chemical reaction. That is definitely safer. So yes, I'm sure batteries will get better, but at the moment they're 100 times too unsafe and 100 times too small to solve the problem.
Okay.
Better to have nuclear. The other thing is that batteries and lots of the technical solutions need minerals and elements from the earth which are not widely available, or you can only get them in parts of the Congo and places that are unstable. You cannot take these things for granted. So there are big problems there.
Yeah, there are problems, but there are engineers who say that they perhaps can overcome it. We'll see. We'll see with time.
Well,
I want to get to focus.
You can't make cobalt.
Yeah, you can mine more though.
But you've got to mine it, and if it isn't there, you can't get it. So it's like gold. You can't make gold just because you want some.
Fair enough. I want to get to the nuclear question now. Let's pivot
Sure.
there. So you've made the argument nuclear is energy dense, and that's a major advantage. It's underappreciated. But why is it so expensive? Why is the perception that it's so expensive? I'll put the question that way.
Well, if Henry Ford had made one Model T Ford, and people had said, I want it to be gold plated, I want it to be so safe, said, well, you can have this option, safety option, and that safety option, and everybody says, well, I want all of them. I want it to be, it's got to be so safe. And every time you accept another option and another maintenance contract and another set of people to look after it in case the other ones aren't there, so the price goes up and up and up, and more people get involved, and more people. But you have to ask, what is it? I mean, if you have a lithium battery, you need a lot of lithium and cobalt and so on. You've got to find out where they come from. But in case of nuclear, there's lots of uranium in the sea. There's no shortage of uranium, and there's 3 times as much thorium. So there is not a problem of resources for nuclear, except for the know-how of how to do it. So education of how to build and experience and the benefits of building tens and hundreds and thousands of nuclear plants, that makes life, that's what you have to pay for. That can become cheaper and cheaper, as Henry Ford learned. So you've got to mass produce things. So if you mass produce nuclear power stations, I'm talking about thousands of nuclear power stations to a completely standard design, they would be very cheap because there's nothing particularly expensive there, except know-how. You only pay people, after all. Money only goes to people.
But then there becomes a question of risk. People would argue that, okay, if a car explodes, car accidents are bad, but there's no major leakage outside of a very small perimeter. And when they look at Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, I know you've done work there. They say there's.
Well, I've never been to Chernobyl, but I've read and studied it a lot. I've been to Fukushima for 4 times, but there were no radiation casualties from nuclear at Fukushima at all. Zero.
Zero.
It was all a problem of people worrying about it. I mean, people do worry about things. They do worry about things. They need to be reassured. But they weren't reassured because the people who should have been doing the reassuring, they didn't know about it either. Now, the trouble is that this is an educational problem, that since the Second World War, the words nuclear and radiation have turned people off, meaning they don't learn any more. It's not that
they get scared.
It's dangerous. It scares them, which stops them learning anything. So when I went to Fukushima, I wasn't surprised, but I found that the lack of trust of people in science and the lack of trust in the authorities and in one another is dreadful. It's a very, very bad effect on society when something like that happens. But the nuclear and the radiation itself have done nothing. I mean, in fact, apart from Chernobyl, nobody has lost. There's been no loss of life from civil nuclear power in 50, 60 years.
We are now speaking here of, just to be clear, of direct loss of life, so either from the explosion or the direct exposure to radiation at the time. And that you said there's been no loss of life. Okay. But then skeptics would say, but okay, that's fine. I accept most people died from the tsunami at Fukushima and 3 Mile Island, and it was well managed.
Of course,
what about the exposure?
Can I stop there? Because the tsunami is very interesting. Because if you go to Japan, as I did, because I went to spoke in schools and so on, you go to the school, and there in the changing room, they've all got hard hats hanging on their pegs in the changing rooms in the schools, because every few months they have an earthquake practice, a tsunami practice. They know about tsunamis. They know about earthquakes. 20,000 people die from tsunamis in March 2011, and society can recover because they've been taught about it. They know what to do when it happens, and they know actually how to protect themselves pretty well. But when the radiation happened, they'd been told that you don't have to worry about this. This is something, it'll never happen. And it did. And they panicked. And they're still panicking about it now.
So when I want to dig into that topic now, because we're talking about radiation, not direct radiation from the explosion. We're talking here about what people would call radiation leakage into the ocean, maybe, or the perimeter. My sister, for what it's worth, worked in Fukushima. She was a teacher there.
Yes,
she taught English.
It's a big place, actually.
Yeah, she taught English there after the radiation attack. There was an outreach to South African teachers. She was one of the only ones to volunteer for Fukushima. And she's alive today. She's got no cancer. Okay, so I can at least attest that the village is safe, the area is safe. There is, however, an exclusion zone around the plant, the former plant. You can visit it, but obviously nobody can go in and out all the time. So I want to now get into the radiation leakage story. Are we misunderstanding radiation leak and ionizing radiation, which is said to be the dangerous one?
Yes. Let me explain. There are two ways that if you actually look at the number of watts per kilogram, the energy of radiation, it is about 9 orders of magnitude less than in sunshine or in it's very low, or compared with the energy of MRI, RF, any of the or ultrasound. The energy.
Just clarify again what radiation you're talking about here.
Well, I'm comparing the energy of exposure to somebody who's having ionizing radiation for a CT scan or something, compared with the energy if they have ultrasound or MRI. It is very, very small indeed. And the only reason that it causes trouble at all is because it is concentrated by the photoelectric effect, in fact. So instead of being smoothly distributed over the whole of your body, it just hits particular atoms. This is actually what Einstein got his Nobel Prize for. His work in 1905 was the photoelectric effect, which was using quantum theory to explain that at these for ionizing radiation, it ionizes, which means where it ionizes, it does an enormous amount of damage, but only one in many, many millions of atoms get ionized. The rest aren't hurt at all.
You just for the audience, just break down what is meant when you say something gets ionized.
I mean that the molecule gets broken.
Okay. So we have molecules on our body. We are exposed to radiation.
Electrons you get bust up, DNAs, anything all gets smashed, right?
Right.
But this has made it very easy for evolution to mend it, because it's not that everything is broken, it's just that 1 in a million have been completely smashed. So what they have to do is what our tissue does is to remove the broken stuff and replace them or mend them, and it's done some brilliant evolutionary development of ways to do that. And in fact, it has to do this for oxygen as well, because when we exercise or something, molecules get broken and cells get damaged, and they have to be removed and they get replaced. And we know this when we have go out in the sunshine, or we go and take exercise. What you're doing is exercising the replacement of cells and so on, and all cells get replaced frequently anyway. So the whole of biology is designed to be this kind of dynamic instant repair mechanism, and the more damages it gets, the better it learns to keep more materials available for mending and replacing. And this is how life works.
So our bodies, or mammalian species, let's use that word, has an ability to fight ionizing radiation. Evolution.
Yeah, I mean, this applies to vegetable matter and everything. All life, there is enough radiation, and in earlier times in the Earth's history, there was more radiation. All life has had to learn to live with radiation. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here.
Okay, but then the question becomes, the question then becomes dosage and concentration of radiation. And
yes,
but maybe explain?
It's incredibly low, incredibly small number of atoms or molecules being broken or smashed. So the ones that are okay don't get. So it's like thinking of Ukraine at the moment, it's like that just a small number of buildings are bombed and are destroyed, and the others are okay. So society can still, and the biological mechanisms can still supply the resources to, and in fact, this is so efficient that it doesn't tell head office up here what it's doing. This kind of replacement is all devolved to the reactions between cells. And so most of life doesn't have a brain anyway. We have made the dreadful mistake of having a protection system which is completely functional as it is for me, and then we have come on and imposed our own ideas about radiation protection on top of it, which is quite unnecessary.
That I want you to clarify. When we talk about radiation safety, generally in a nuclear structure, you would build a thick wall. It was 1 or 2 meters, if I remember correctly. And the idea is the radiations or the neutrinos in terms of ether would not penetrate it after a long period of time. And that is to protect us against a certain exposure that was measured in sieverts, if I remember correctly the number. And are you saying those limits that we have imposed are arbitrary, or they are out of touch with what we can handle?
Yes, they factor about a factor of 1,000. It's about a factor of 1,000 times safer. Now, for instance, there was an accident with a radiotherapy source, actually of cesium-137, which is exactly one of the radionuclides which was released at Fukushima and at Chernobyl. But this was being used for radiotherapy in a place called Goiânia in Brazil in 1987. And some people broke in the hospital where this was being used. People broke into it, and some scrap metal merchants said, "Oh, there's a nice lump of steel." And they took this thing home, they broke it open, their children saw this glowing thing, they played with it in the kitchen, they painted themselves with it, they invited the neighbors in. And in the end, about 250 people had been seriously contaminated, about 70 of them internally. They've actually swallowed, because it's all over their kitchen, they'd been eating it. And so these people have been...
It sounds like Homer Simpson, you know.
For over 25, or 1987 anyway, I've spoken to the doctor who was in charge of it. These people, now 6 of these people died from acute radiation syndrome, like the people who got the fires out at Chernobyl. But the remainder, who've been very carefully followed in the years that have followed, some of them got terribly depressed and died of drink, of alcoholism and drugs and so on, but not directly caused by the radiation, but caused by the fear of being ostracized by other people, being told, you have been irradiated, and being kept in hospital for ages and so on. But in fact, other than the 6 people who died, there have been no cases of cancer at all. And it's now known that, in fact, although radiation can kill people, and it did kill these people, it's not a very good source of, it's not a very good carcinogen, or it doesn't generate cancer very efficiently.
I want to clarify that. You're saying that radiation exposure, high levels of it, higher than the safety ratings we put in, is not a carcinogen. Oh, it's a very poor one.
It's not, it's a poor one. For instance, the number of people who died of radiation in the 50 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki was just over 400, which is a quarter of the number of deaths, which was result of people panicking at Fukushima and displacing old people from old homes and so on. And there were serious incidents of loss of life from panic and fear. So even when two places have been bombed with nuclear bombs and the patients have been followed, because 100,000 people have been followed this way for the next 50 years, less than 1%. I mean, a lot of people died from the blast and the fire. Hundreds of thousands died from the blast and the fire, but it wasn't actually any worse than died from the conventional bombing of Tokyo and Dresden and Hamburg and Berlin and so on.
So where does the theory come from then that radiation is a carcinogen? Do we misunderstand cancer?
Well, it's not. Well, there's two things. The first thing that they worried about was that it should break the DNA in your thing, and it would generate rogue kinds of DNA, which would then create people with two heads and aberrant. Now, this doesn't happen, and it didn't happen at all at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in the 1950s, when people were in big panic about radiation, this was the main thing that they were worried about, that subsequent generations would suffer the effects of genetic malformations and so on. Now, I'm not a biologist, but there is no evidence, and there is nobody who has any technical knowledge who is saying that this happens. Now,
I want to substantiate that, because I spoke here to a person on cancer research on this topic who claims that the theory that gene mutation causes cancer is misplaced.
So I'm not talking about causing cancer at the moment. I'm talking about causing genetic abnormalities which affect subsequent generations.
Okay, so you're saying that theory is also misplaced.
That the subsequent genetic malformations and creating people with 3 ears and 2 eyes, 4 eyes, and so on, that doesn't happen.
Right.
And there's a long history about why and whose personal ambitions and so on, and who funded it, so on. And so I won't go into all that, but there is no evidence for that. What there is evidence for is some cancer. But as I say, the cancer numbers that are just over 400 are the number of cancers in 50 years from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 400 more than would have been in the normal course of other Japanese people of that age group, etc., etc.
And that might be within the variation of the data. If it's 400,
no. The numbers are big enough to know that it's not just variation data, because you're looking at the medical records of 100,000 people for 50 years. So this is a very high statistics approach. So it's certainly known that people died of cancer as a result of being bombed by Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but nothing like the number that people expect. It's about 1% of the number of people who died, of less than 1%, well, 400 in 100,000, who died from the blast and the fire.
Right.
The
question would be, the question is relevant here because Hiroshima and Nagasaki was nuclear bombs. So there was flames, there was probably toxins or carcinogens, all the other things in the environment could have played.
Yes, but you'll get the toxins and the carcinogens and all. You get all the normal things of bombing, like happening in Syria and seems to be happening now there's plenty of evil in the world, and you can cause plenty of trouble with ordinary chemical explosives.
Right. But that's the point I'm trying to make, is that.
But there's nothing extra. Nuclear doesn't really bring any extra to that, which surprised people.
It's news to me. I mean, I was always taught nuclear is a carcinogen. Stay away from it. Be very careful. And you're saying, we have misattributed it. So what would be the implication if what you're saying now is true, and I'm assuming it's true? What would the implication then be for our nuclear safety standards?
Well, this is what we're talking about. The nuclear safety standards are 1,000 times too tight. Now, we know, Mary Curie and her work for 120 years, we know that you can kill cells with radiation. That's how cancer therapy works. And so the medics very skillfully know exactly how much radiation you can get to kill cells. But that is way, way over anything that anybody had, even at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The safety standards ought to be relaxed by a factor of about 1,000. This in itself would make nuclear energy much safer. It would also enable nuclear to be used and radiation to be used much more effectively in medicine, because at the moment a lot of people refuse CT scans, or they are advised not to have CT scans because they think it might be dangerous, when in fact the bigger danger is the cancer or the problem that they're being examined for.
So I want to substantiate this point, and I understand this is a taboo topic. It is I've worked with a nuclear regulator. They'd be very difficult for them to even listen to this conversation. I hope they listen. But yeah. I want to substantiate this with a point. A friend of mine sent me photos of wildlife at Chernobyl. Okay, in Chernobyl, we all accept was the worst nuclear accident, except maybe for the bombs, right? It's the worst leakage one.
Yeah.
And the wildlife is flourishing in the exclusion zone. Okay. Have we got any studies to look at cancer rates or something of the sort among those the species there?
Well, it's there are lots of studies. Some of those studies are people who the animals. For instance, there are papers which says that the birds have been adversely affected. Now, in fact, the fact that it's an exclusion zone has changed the environment completely, so that the birds migrate differently and they eat different things, and that they fly in and out. You can only really be sure about the effects of radiation and nuclear, if you compare two lots of people or animals or something, where one lot have been affected and the other lot haven't and are otherwise the same. So you could do that with two lots of mice in a laboratory, or you can do it also with people who have lived all their lives in some place in Iran or in Brazil, where the natural radioactivity from the rock is 10, 20, 100 times bigger than it is in normal. Do those people get cancer?
Well, I would add this in Johannesburg. When you mine gold, you sometimes mine it with uranium. And when my father was a child, they could go down the mines and play with the uranium. And my father doesn't have cancer yet, so, and I don't think it's a big issue.
Yeah, but one mustn't argue from one. There is a chap in Japan, or was, who was in Hiroshima, and he on the fatal day, and he was bombed, and he just managed to survive. So he got on a train and went home to Nagasaki, and a few days later he got bombed there, and he died. He died. Well, he died the other day at the age of 93.
Well, so what a unlucky guy.
I mean, it's a little more difficult to discuss it when it comes to Mary Curie herself, who must have been, she was very careful, but potentially exposed to huge amounts of radioactivity. But she died of plastic anemia or something. I mean, I don't know the technical details, but let's say it was cancer. But in fact, she was 67 when she died, which is actually the normal lifespan of somebody of her age and her background at that time.
And her husband died of a horse. I think it was died of falling off a horse. So all the radiation exposure.
Yes. Well, her husband, who was a physicist who worked with her, he died in a horse traffic accident in Paris. Want to be careful going to Paris. No, one mustn't argue from single cases like that.
Okay, so you're saying this is quite a very shattering topic, because you're saying that we need to relax nuclear safety to make nuclear energy profitable, because the expensive nature of it.
Well, we would make, because we would survive much better if we relaxed. But of course, why doesn't that happen? Well, one of the reasons that doesn't happen is jobs, because most people are much more concerned about their jobs than their knowledge. And they will, if they're offered a good job, the question of what the knowledge behind it is comes secondary.
Yes.
And there's a lovely quote, which in this game I collect quotes. There's a quote by an American journalist who said, "It's amazing how difficult it is to persuade somebody of something when their salary depends on them not understanding it."
Sinclair, I think, is the guy's name. Yes,
that's right.
Yeah. Okay. My previous guest made the quote, so it's not that I have a remarkable remarkable knowledge. I'm not.
No, well, these things are going around.
Okay, so you're but I mean, how do you think we can take this argument then to the nuclear regulator and tell them, look, we have long-term cohort studies, we have.
Well, I tell you, let me tell you that when I in 2019 there was a conference in Vienna for the IAEA on nuclear energy and climate change. And so I wrote a paper on the whole business of how nuclear energy fitted into the energies, the sources of energy that we have to choose from, and problems with renewables and problems with fossil fuels and the problems with nuclear and so on. And well, they didn't like me very much.
You were threatening their jobs.
My paper was pushed down. I was pushed down into the poster session. And actually, I had some very interesting discussions with people but the people who are professional, most of them, when one says that nuclear could be much cheaper, and the regulations could be much simpler, that means less jobs. It means that most of the people who are currently working on that would lose their job, or the empires would. And that's not a very popular proposal.
I can imagine.
I mean, we have, there's a group of about 200 of us around the world in an outfit called SARI. Are you a member of SARI?
No. Maybe I should join.
Maybe you should. It's called Scientists for Accurate Radiation Information. I don't know, it's a very good name. But anyway, I was one of what started it, but we've got people from Canada and the United States and Italy and Germany and all over Poland and Australia and New Zealand, people all over the world who are professionally looking at and supporting pretty much what I've been saying to you.
Because I asked this question because a lot of African governments are asking the question that how are we going to power the continent? I mean, given that at the end of the century, a third of humanity will be in Africa. And a lot of African governments are opening up to nuclear power, but they are approaching the International Atomic Energy Agency. They're approaching all these high priests of nuclear science for their standards. And you're saying, well, perhaps they're looking at the wrong location if they come to make their safety standards. They should be more open-minded to not make the same mistakes that the Europeans and the Americans have made.
Well, this shouldn't be a matter for the United Nations. We shouldn't need the IAEA. Skin cancer and overexposure to ultraviolet radiation is much more serious, but we don't have a branch of the United Nations in charge of sunbathing.
The ozone layer.
But that would make more sense than having the IAEA. Now, I went out to, I haven't been to Africa but I've lectured in Australia, but I've been out to Jakarta, and they said to me, what should we do? And I said, I tell you what, I think you should study, because in the next 20 or 30 years, and this is a few years ago now, so maybe 10 or 20 years, you're going to need to know about radiation and nuclear. And that is what you should do. The problem is a problem of education. And once Henry Ford is starting to produce thousands of small nuclear reactors, and that's what we've got to do, where we've got to go, then what you're going to need in Africa is people who know how to use them.
That's right.
Safely, yes, but safety is only part of it. You've got to know how to how to use it effectively and responsibly, because it can be dangerous and it can be misused, like this thing in Brazil. So I think it's a matter of education. But there's another thing that I want to get my knife into, and that's intellectual property, because we saw this with the COVID. Capitalism was fantastic at coming up with vaccines, much better than anybody expected. But to get them out into the rest of the world, oh no, they've got to be paid for.
Well,
somebody owns it.
If not even that, there's no money in off-label medication that has got no patent on it.
We've not only got to have thousands of nuclear power, of small modular reactors, we've got to give them away.
I see.
But we can only give them away to people who know how to use them.
So would you be comfortable, theoretically speaking, if every village or town has a small modular reactor operating, assuming they know how to use it? No.
Yes. Let me give you another thing. One of the important things we're going to have to live with if climate change is really important is we're not going to, these big renewable plants and the infrastructure to send electrical energy from North Africa to the UK. I mean, that's crazy, absolutely crazy. That's all going to get, most of that infrastructure is going to get very easily destroyed. What we need is a small modular reactor for every 100,000, 200,000 people, providing all of their electricity at the peak demand level, and off-peak producing hydrogen, desalinated water, and water is going to be incredibly important in the future in Africa and everywhere else as well. It's going to produce fertilizers and ammonia and you name it. So
you make
a
the
much
argument
smaller.
let me rephrase the argument in another way. And this is your work. You've written a lot on the energy transitions and civilizations and actual energy transitions to more dense fuel. And you're making the argument here that that nuclear can serve as the backbone of, say, the new industrial age, in a sense. Nuclear provides the energy for maybe hydrogen for ammonia.
Yes. Oh, well, look, the old industrial age is at an end. If we stop using fossil fuels, the industrial revolution, which was built on fossil fuels, is finished.
Is that is that conceivable? I'm skeptical of the idea
Yes.
that we can get rid of
Why
fossil
not?
fuels.
Oh, I think we may well have enormous loss of life in the next few years. One piece that I wrote.
You just interrupt. One of the listeners just bought one of your books, so
I can see that. I've got hundreds of them, and I've taken over distribution of them. So they're going to come from me. You can get them from Amazon. But if anybody wants to email me directly, we can come to some arrangement. Or I can ship them up in bulk to Africa or wherever for both books.
yeah.
But I think there's a whole new way of thinking. Now, let me tell you something else. If EDF or somebody is building a huge Hinkley Point, which is 200 miles away, That doesn't give me reassurance. I want something which is 20 miles away, where my family, I know somebody who works there, where my children on their school visits, they go and visit it, and they get a real community involvement with the nuclear power station. Now, the scale of small modular reactors is going to match that kind of picture. And it gets me mad when EDF says, this is the biggest crane in the world. I don't want the biggest crane in the world. We want small cranes and small things and things that are floated in, and they're building things that float in on the sea. And this is going to work not only well in my way of thinking, but in Africa, provided you can have the education and the political stability, etc., to look after it. That is a big question.
No, indeed.
But that's not really peculiar to nuclear, is it?
No, it's and corruption, which is quite common, unfortunately, throughout the African continent.
Yes.
But since I came to Europe, I realized that I might have had too much prejudice to my own continent, because when I look at European corruption, sometimes I'm amazed at the numbers being thrown around.
Yes, well, depends what you call corruption, doesn't it? But it's certainly, if you can keep things small, I think corruption is easier to keep under control.
It's projects that are too big to fail become the black hole for these things. Are you excited about Rolls-Royce building a small modular reactor? Do you think that model and the prototype
Yes,
will work?
well, I tell you why I'm excited, because I think we are in the same position as we were at the end of the 19th century, when we suddenly realized that it wasn't necessary to have somebody waving a red flag walking in front of a car, and we could suddenly build small cars, and we didn't need great big steam engines, which frightened the horses and so on. So then, and suddenly, especially in France and in Germany too, and eventually even in the UK, because we were behind then, there were lots of different designs of cars. So the engineering of small modular reactors and the Generation 4 ones, there are so many possibilities, and most of them will work, and most of them will go bust because there won't be the resources to develop them all. But I think it's very exciting in the same way as the development of transport was at the beginning of the 20th century. So it's just a question of, where is Henry Ford? Where is the person who's going to build these reactors on a 1,000-off basis?
Okay, and you have no preference for any of the prototypes or the type of reactors, whether it's
I mean, there are people I'm watching. We've got to get away from the pressure from the pressurized water reactors, and the molten salt, because the extra engineering pressure of the very high pressures is not a good idea, which is why I think molten salt seems like a good, but even within the molten salt, there are lots of different, and then there's molten lead and all sorts of things.
I think Canada is investing a lot into molten salt at the moment.
Well, Canada is actually, Canada, I think, in my book, is the most advanced country in the world, because they are following up even the best reactor that's come out of the UK, which is, I think, Moltex. And where's that being developed? In New Brunswick. But it's still it's still also based in the UK.
Okay.
So yes, I agree with you. Canada is a great place.
Well, yeah, they've made advances on that. Professor, I'll give you the last word on nuclear energy. Is there anything, if there's any message you want to get across to the public on nuclear that we haven't mentioned yet? Is there anything of that sort?
Well, I think the most important, there are only lots of people who aren't really looking at jobs. And one is retired people like me, and the other is children.
Yeah. And
the people in the middle, it's very difficult. They've probably got jobs, careers, and mortgages, and so on to worry about. But children from the age of 10 upwards should be learning about nuclear power, and they know how to deal with really dangerous things like personal biological waste. And they learn about that at the age of 1 and 2, and we don't allow them out into society till they're capable of looking after it. So children are far more resilient and clever than we ever give them intelligence for. And it's their world that we're talking about. So let's concentrate on the children. Don't worry about people of my age or below. But you use people like me, because I don't know how to, I'm 81. Not long to go, but a job to do.
Well, Professor,
I'm happy to come and talk to anybody or do anything. It's nice speaking to you.
So before you leave the world, we're going to have you back for another conversation on nuclear energy. This was fascinating, and thank you very much for sharing your knowledge.